Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. We're doing something a bit different this week as I deep dive into the idea of engine versus non-engine for beginners. Getting started right away, what is engine and what is non-engine? So the term engine refers to cards that are in your deck with the explicit purpose of creating a specific board state. These would be combo pieces, one card boss monsters. If you're something like Vanquish Soul, like your Vanquish Soul cards are part of your engine, and so most decks get their names from the engine pieces that they choose to use. They're complementary, they work together towards an end goal. Non-engine refers to any pieces that you would put in your deck that is not necessarily working towards an end goal, but serves its own separate purpose in the deck. So, that means things like, as we're going to go over today, hand traps, board breakers, floodgates, and consistency increasers. So let's get started with hand traps. This will not be an in-depth guide on every hand trap in the game. I might do that in the future, but we're just going to glance over what hand traps are, what they do for you, and some different varieties of them. So starting off, our very first hand trap that was ever made in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Kuriboh. The idea is that if your opponent attacks you during the battle phase, you can discard Kuriboh and take no damage. So this is the basic effect of what we call a hand trap. You discard it from your hand at normally quick effect speed to stop the opponent from doing something, in Kuriboh's case, damaging you. There's actually been a number of cards similar to Kuriboh, better versions that have been made throughout the years that stop the opponent from damaging you. Things like Battle Fader, which when the opponent attacks you, you don't discard it, you summon it, and it not only prevents the damage, it completely stops the battle phase, giving you a body and making sure that you get another turn to survive. The best version of this effect has probably been Gore's in the Edison time period or format. He gives you two bodies, both of them are very large bodies, he's very difficult to get rid of, and even something like Battle Fader has seen play in Tenpai, but generally these kinds of effects that are stopping the opponent from killing you are not terribly great, just because, as you will learn as you play the game, most of the time a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is decided outside of the battle phase, which is why much more useful in an average game are cards like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Ash Blossom essentially says if your opponent would touch their deck and move a card out of their deck to anywhere else, you discard Ash Blossom and say no. This is probably the most widely played hand trap in the game currently, because it is just so ubiquitously useful. It stops most decks from doing things that they want to do once. That is the real weakness of this type of hand trap, the ones where you use it once and it interrupts the opponent and then they get to keep going. It does not stop them from continuing with a different line of play. So these type of effects, these single-use interruptions, include things like Ash Blossom to stop people from touching their deck, Ghost Spell to stop people from touching the graveyard, and then actual traps on occasion, things like Infinite Impermanence, which negates from hand if you have no cards when you play it, and Dominus Purge, which again, if you have nothing on the field, you can activate this from your hand, and it has a similar effect to Ash Blossom. We also have things that interrupt their graveyard, things like Didi Crow and Skullmeister, just all of these one-use interruption cards. These have historically been the most played and possibly the best type of non-engine, but the game has gotten faster and faster over the years, and even these cards are starting to fall out of favor in exchange for cards that have a much bigger, more grandiose effect that can actually stop the opponent in one card, and we'll get to those towards the end. So next up in our list of non-engine, we have what are known as board breakers. These are cards where the purpose is to fight through an opponent's established board rather than the single-use hand traps, whose purpose is to stop the opponent from setting up a board in the first place. So Lightning Storm, you can only activate it when you control no face-up cards, but you can destroy all of your opponent's attack position monsters or all their spells and traps. This is a huge game-winning swingy effect that Similar to things like DD Crow, have kind of started to fall out of favor because the opponents nowadays tend to have protection from effects like this. I'm talking about like Lightning Storm, Raigeki, Harpy's Feather Duster. These are all cards where the point is to like mass sweep the opponent's board off so that you can then do your own thing without having to worry about what they've previously set up. More effective nowadays than these are cards that are uninteractable by the opponent. We're talking about things like Dark Ruler No More, which negates the effect of all face-up monsters your opponent controls until the end of this turn, and no one can activate monster effects in response to this card. Most of these cards come with a nasty downside that prevents you from beating the opponent on the turn that you use them. Dark Ruler makes it so your opponent can take no damage for the rest of the turn, making it all but impossible to actually kill them on a turn when you activated Dark Ruler, but it allows you to take back the going first mantle from them and set up your board while dismantling the board that they put out during their first turn. Board breakers in general are traditionally used going second, and so it really depends on the current meta and things like that, which of these kinds of cards you end up wanting to use. Handtraps are much more useful going first, whereas board breakers are a going second tool. Also in this line of uninteractable board breakers, we have things like Forbidden Droplet, which you can send cards from your hand or field to the graveyard, negate a bunch of monster effects, and your opponent can't respond to it. So you just turn off all their stuff, and they can't do anything about it. The problem with Forbidden Droplet is that you have to send cards. Most of the decks that actually use this use the fact that it is a quick effect spell, and so they will activate other spells that gain them benefit and then chain Forbidden Droplet, sending the first card that they activated to allow them to use the Forbidden Droplet without wasting a card, because that one was going to go to the graveyard anyways and they get both effects. That's most of the time the kind of decks that will use Forbidden Droplet, but it's really good because specifically it does not prevent you from winning on the turn that you use it, and you can also, if you're going first, you can set it, and because it's a quick effect, you can use it on the opponent's turn. Forbidden Droplet's a super good board breaker. However, Droplet only affects monsters, same as Dark Ruler No More. What if we need to get rid of spells and traps? Well, then we're looking at something like Evenly Matched. Evenly Matched has to be activated at the end of your battle phase, which is a little bit of an odd condition, but it's pretty much there to make sure that you don't get your battle phase and you don't get to kill the opponent after you've used Evenly Matched. Because Evenly Matched, when activated at the end of the battle phase, makes your opponent banish cards face down until they control the same amount of cards you do. Evenly Matched counts as one card, and you can only activate it from your hand if you have no other cards, meaning that they basically have to banish down to one card for Evenly Matched. Traps are the type of card that is least likely to be interactable by your opponent, meaning that Evenly Matched is very likely to resolve when you actually do it, unless they have an Omni Negate on the field. People aren't traditionally making like a Naturia Barkion or something like that that specifically stops traps. You're really just worried about Omni Negates, and banishing face down means that they are not going to get any value out of those cards. They're not going to the graveyard, you're not going to trigger Goatees. It's just those cards are out of the game, and they have to survive with whichever one they have left while you rebuild your board. Next up in our list of non-engine are so-called Floodgates. Floodgates are mostly continuous traps, oddly enough, and their whole purpose is to stop the opponent from actually activating specific types of effects or doing things in general. They change the game rules on the opponent to make them playing the game more difficult. So Skill Drain, for example, you have to pay 1,000 life points to activate it, and obviously because it is a continuous trap, you have to activate it after your first turn, but when activated, all effects of all face-up monsters are negated for the entire time that Skill Drain is on the field. That makes it incredibly difficult for combo decks, or really anyone, to do much in the way of anything. Skill Drain is traditionally used with huge bodies, so basically you put like a 3,000, 4,000 attack body on the field, and then flip a Skill Drain, and the opponent can't really get over the thing that you have, and they have to find a way to destroy skill drain before they can do much of anything. Other types of floodgates include there can only be one, which makes each person only have one monster of each type and send the rest to the graveyard when it's activated. So you can only have, as per our artwork here, one zombie at a time, one psychic, one aqua, whatever have you. Some decks don't care and they'll play through it perfectly fine. Other decks just straight up cannot play under this limitation. Then we've got Goes in Match, and Goes in Match makes it so each person can only have one type of attribute on the field. So that means you only have fire, you only have earth, you only have light, you only have dark, and same thing, this completely stops certain decks from playing the game. That's kind of the entire point of Floodgates. While initially the idea was to slow the game down and kind of try and force people to play in interesting ways, nowadays they are used in conjunction with each other just to stop opponents from playing the game at all, because so many decks cannot function under one of these effects. Same as Secret Village of the Spellcasters, our only non-trap here, which says if you control a spellcaster monster, which at least gives it a condition, your opponent cannot activate spell cards, and if you have no spellcasters, you can't activate spell cards. So you have to keep a spellcaster on the field for Secret Village, but if you do, then the opponent cannot activate, say, any of our board breakers or any other spell cards that may be integral to their game plan. So that's Floodgates, arguably the category on this list that is the most hated, because often if a deck is playing Floodgates, the entire game devolves into, can you play under skill drain? Can you play under there can only be one? If you can't, you might as well concede, because the opponent has made sure that they can play under all of these effects, and maybe it'll take them forever to actually close out the game, but they'll get there and you've got nothing you can do about it. So our last type of non-engine is what I call consistency boosters. These are things like the classic Pot of Greed, which just draws you 2 cards. The point of consistency boosters, as the name suggests, is to increase the consistency of your deck. You put these in your deck in place of other cards because these will draw you through your deck to find you the pieces that you actually want. And what happens is that the math works out such that if you're playing, say, 3 Upstart Goblins, which all it does is draw you a card and give your opponent 1,000 life, well, that is 3 cards in your deck that if you see them, you just get rid of them and get another chance at a card you care about more. That is why they are consistency boosters. You use them to increase the likelihood, sort of increasing the number of copies of every other card in your deck, because this one just doesn't matter. If you see it, it'll go away and give you something better anyways. That's why cards like Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity were so incredibly overpowered that they had to get banned, because these cards with no once per turn clause on them, that just means that you had such incredible consistency to your deck. You always saw exactly what you needed. You had extra cards in your hand all the time. There was no reason to ever not play these cards. That's why they had to ban them. Now we have weaker versions, such as the Upstart Goblin, but Upstart Goblin still sees play in a lot of decks that don't need that many engine pieces, and it just increases the chance of you seeing the ones that you actually care about. These are used in very, very consistent combo decks most of the time, or just decks that really like to have spells in the graveyard. You'll always see Upstart Goblin and Sky Strikers because they just really want to have 3 spells in the graveyard anyways, and this gives them an extra 1 at the cost of 0 cards. Can't beat it. Similar to things like Chicken Game. Chicken Game makes it so the player with the lowest life points takes no damage, and once per turn you can pay 1,000 life to draw a card, destroy this card, or give your opponent 1,000 life. This is not interactable, which means that the opponent can't stop you from drawing your card off of it. And you're normally playing Chicken Game in decks where you get to send it to the graveyard either by replacing it with a new field spell, or just for an effect. Say White Forest likes to send spells to the graveyard, they'll play Chicken Game, you draw an extra card, and you get a piece of fuel on top of that. Just a really good card, boosts your consistency, gives you materials. We also have the rest of the pots, and while they are not nearly as strong as Pot of Greed, most of these have seen the ban list, or at least the limited list themselves, just because the increased consistency is so good. Pot of Desires is used in decks that do not care about losing specific pieces. It's used in very, very redundant decks, and in those decks, it basically reads like a once per turn Pot of Greed. Incredible card. Same thing with Pot of Prosperity. If you don't care that much about your extra deck, or you have extra deck space, then it just gives you the ability to dig for whatever piece you need at any given time, increasing your consistency through the roof. These cards may look a little bit more unassuming than something like a Floodgate or a Board Breaker, but these should not be forgotten. They are very, very powerful cards, and I want to say that consistency boosters have seen the most bans, possibly, of any category of non-engine. And then I want to close out with a few that I consider combinations of the varieties of non-engine. So we've got Nibiru up first. Nibiru is a hand trap, definitely, but it's also a board breaker. So the idea of Nibiru is during the opponent's main phase, or your main phase, but you're almost never going to use it then, if your opponent has normal or special summoned 5 or more monsters this turn, you can quick effect tribute everything on the field to summon Nibiru, and give the opponent a giant token based on how much attack and defense everything that was tributed had. So the idea of Nibiru is that if your opponent's doing this big long combo, they get 5 in, they don't have a negate or any way to protect themselves, you just show them Nibiru, tribute everything, give them this token, and say combo off from this point if you can. So you've got a 3000 attack monster going into your turn, you have broken the opponent's board. If they can keep going, they can keep going, but if you use Nibiru at the right time, it can completely end a game for people. We've also got the tactics cards. These are board breakers / consistency boosters. The idea is that you have to have your opponent use a monster effect to use these cards. Normally you're going to use them in the event of your opponent throwing a hand trap of some kind at you, and then you get to activate Triple Tactics Talent, draw 2 cards. That's a Pot of Greed, we love it. Or if your deck has a really good target for Triple Tactics Thrust, you can then use that one because your opponent has used a hand trap or other monster effect on you. And Tactics Thrust lets you either set a card if your opponent doesn't have a monster, or add a card to your hand. It has to be a normal spell or trap, which conveniently means that you can get a Triple Tactics Talent and then use that to draw a couple of extra cards. You could also use it to get a Dark Ruler No More to stop the opponent from interacting with you further, but you couldn't use it to get, say, a Skill Drain. And then also in this category I consider Called by the Grave. Called by the Grave is kind of the opposite of the tactics cards, in that instead of rewarding you when your opponent interacts with your plays, it just stops the opponent from interacting with your plays. If, say, for example, someone would ash a key part of your combo and then your turn is over and you go to their turn and they just kill you, well, you can Called by on the Ash Blossom, say, hold up. That's not happening right now. And then it negates the effects of that card for the next 2 turns, your turn and your opponent's next turn. So it's also, I consider it a consistency booster because it stops the opponent from stopping you. It's counterplay to counterplay. And then last and possibly most powerfully, we have the combination hand trap Floodgates. So this category of card, you discard it like a hand trap, and it stops the opponent from doing something, or in some cases rewards you when your opponent does something, for 1 turn. They do not stay on the field like a Floodgate would, but they stop the opponent for 1 turn, and these cards are very, very strong and probably the most powerful non-engine pieces in the game right now. These are things like Droll and Lockbird. Droll says that when your opponent adds a card from their main deck to their hand, except during the draw phase, you can discard this and stop either player from adding cards to hand for the rest of the turn. That means that your opponent's combo, where they had to search a bunch of pieces to hand in order and use them repeatedly, yeah, they can't do that anymore. It doesn't stop special summoning directly to the field or anything like that, but many, many decks cannot play if they can't add cards to hand. We've also got the much maligned Dimension Shifter. Dimension Shifter has to be activated when you have no cards in your graveyard, so it's normally activated if you're going second, or some decks can use it at the beginning of their turn, say Malice for example, to actually increase their consistency. while also floodgating the opponent for a turn, because Dimension Shifter makes it so any card that is sent to the graveyard is banished until the end of next turn. So if you activate Dimension Shifter on your turn, do your whole Malice combo, your whole Kashtira combo, then pass to the opponent, they then have to play under whatever board you made alongside Shifter still being there until the end of their turn. Then we've got the Maxis. So Maxis are kind of a floodgate in that they make it so if the opponent special summons a card, after you use this effect, you draw a card. And so that's an interesting effect that throughout a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh's history was not too terribly relevant, but nowadays people are special summoning 10, 20, 30 times in a turn, and so if they see a Max C come down, that means that you get to draw almost your entire deck if they go through with their combo, and as you do that, you're going to be drawing Handtraps, you're going to be throwing Ash Blossoms and Ghost Bells and Imperms at them to interrupt them along the way. So I consider this a floodgate because these kinds of effects basically prompt the opponent to do a little bit, just whatever they can, and then pass the turn, because if they keep trying to do the turn, they will inevitably fail to your plethora of hand traps and board breakers and all the engine that you've been drawing. Currently Max C is banned, and so right now we have the Mulch Armies filling this role, but those are still super good and basically read skip your opponent's current turn in a majority of matchups. And so the last thing I want to talk about is, well, you've got all of these options for non-engines. Which one are you supposed to be playing in your deck? My recommendation, for beginners especially, is always find which ones have synergy with your deck in particular. I brought up Sky Strikers and Upstart Goblin. They also love Board Breakers because Board Breakers put spells in their graveyard as well. White Forest and Chicken Game, they love each other. Gold Pride and Chicken Game are a match made in heaven. The Ghost Girls, the level 3 tuner hand trap line, there are a ton of these. They go super well in Punk. So what I recommend is figure out what you're playing and what has synergy with what you're playing and start there. Outside of that, it's basically dependent on the meta. Right now, we are at a point in the game where single-use hand traps are not normally good enough. If you throw an Ash Blossom at someone's combo, it stops part of the combo, but then the card that you stop normally has another effect in the graveyard that they can use to continue comboing off. Ash Blossom is not good enough anymore. It's still good, and you still really want to play it to stop Fuelos and other Mulch Army cards, but it's not going to actually stop an opponent's combo. So my recommendation right now is to play Board Breakers, Dark Ruler, any of the, like, Feather Duster and Lightning Storm are pretty good against Malice right now. If Thrust is a really good card for your deck, be playing Thrust. But outside of that, play the Hand Trap Floodgates. So Nibiru stops some decks, but not really Ryziel and Malice, especially if they can see it coming. You really, right now, you want to be playing Drone Lockbird and Artifact Lancea. Lancea is against Malice. It stops either player from banishing cards for a turn. So against Malice, that tends to just end their turn, similar to how Drone Lockbird does for a lot. But Lancea has fewer applications and is less devastating to most decks, but if you're playing against a lot of Malice, a lot of Kashtira, you want to be throwing Lanceas in there. Of course, if you can afford them, the Mulch Armies are incredible. They basically, like I said, they often read as skip your opponent's current turn. The downside right now being that all of the Mulch Armies are incredibly expensive, though they are getting reprinted at some time this year, which will bring the price down significantly. Maybe hold off until then, especially if you're just starting, which the whole point of this guide is people who are starting or just getting back into Yu-Gi-Oh! And so that's going to be our guide to non-engine. I see a lot of people kind of struggling with what they're supposed to be playing, what's good at any given time, why should they even be playing non-engine in the first place, things like that. I've run into enough people at locals who are like, well, I want to play the hero deck, and I don't really have non-engine in there because I want to do my big fancy combo. The problem is that if other people are playing non-engine cards, you're not going to get your big fancy combo off. They'll stop you, and then when it goes to their turn, they'll just beat you on their turn. Everyone can OTK right now. Everyone can defeat you in a single turn. That means that if you're not stopping their plays, you are already dead. You can't just be playing your deck. You have to be playing your deck in ways to stop the opponent's deck. And that is where the non-engine pieces come into play for the most part. Outside of consistency boosters, those are a little bit more niche. And just to mention specifics, a lot of the top decks recently have been playing somewhere in the vicinity of like 18 to 20 pieces of non-engine in a 40-card deck, meaning that the less cards your actual engine can run with, the more of these you can play, and the more of these you can play, the better you can stop your opponent from playing. That gives you the best chance of actual success. That is why these decks are at the top a lot of the times, because they're doing powerful things while still having space to have, 3 pieces of interruption in their opening hand. If you're just starting off, don't worry about that too much, but try to make sure that you're fitting at least like 10 copies of non-engine into any 40-card deck. If you go above that, I try for like a 1/3 ratio if possible. A little below that's still fine, but half is really the most optimal place you can be. And so that's going to do it for this one, guys. Please leave a like if you liked the video. Please let me know in the comments if you hated this, if I missed anything, if I made anything unclear. Reminder that this was not intended to be a comprehensive list of hand traps or anything. I might do that in the future. This was just meant to be an introduction to the idea of non-engine for returning players or, new players. So that'll be it, guys. Hope you have a good day. Bye.